Welcome to my views and news. Tuesday's first video, first news story is about Ethiopian PM Abiy, who was awarded an award a few hours ago in the US. He is in the US. There he arrived to attend US Africa Summit last year. US news sources were saying that PM Abiy was turning into a global pariah, and now he is being awarded award for outstanding leadership in Africa. Secondly, viewers, while PM Abiy is in the US, Tigrayans and Amharas are planning separate protests outside the venue where PM Abiy will attend US Africa Summit. And thirdly, viewers, a top Oromo activist, a social media activist, has been arrested. Who is he? Where was he arrested? This is not the first time this man has been arrested. What we saw in the Amhara region a few months ago, same seems to be starting to happen in the Oromo. Firstly, viewers, African leadership is in the US, where US Africa Summit is going to kick off today, a 3-day summit. US is hosting African leadership. Out of 54 African countries, 49 have been invited to attend this summit. Sudan, Guinea, Mali and Burkina Faso's leadership was not invited due to coups in these countries. Eritrea was not invited. Isaias Afwerki was not invited. So Isaias Afwerki is in Africa and rest of African leadership is in the US now. Entire Africa responsibility is on the shoulders of Isaias Afwerki. He's alone in Africa, but he has the guts to monitor the entire Africa. He's been left here to see the internal, external situation in Africa. PM Abiy he was invited too, and he arrived in the US a few hours ago with the first lady. He arrived in the US. You can see a picture on your screen showing PM Abiy and the first wife when they arrived in the US. There in the US, PM Abiy was honored with an award, which is called Outstanding African Leadership Award. American Academy of Achievements and the Global Hope Coalition awarded this award to PM Abiy. Why? Because the award has been granted for PM Abiy's outstanding performance in the fight against climate change. PM Abiy's government launched Green Legacy project. Billions of seedlings have been planted. And PM Abiy's government claims that 25 million Ethiopians were mobilized to plant 25 billion seedlings. So that is why, since Ethiopia is fighting climate change, that is why this work of the government was recognized by this organization, and PM Abiy was granted this Outstanding African Leadership Award in the US by an NGO. This American Academy of Achievements and the Global Hope Coalition is an NGO basically. Last year, I remember that US-based news outlets were saying that PM Abiy had turned into a global pariah, an outcast, that international players wanted to distance themselves from PM Abiy. And now PM Abiy is being given this award for outstanding leadership in Africa. Things have changed in favor of PM Abiy. TPLF has suffered military setbacks globally, locally, in the region as well. PM Abiy is emerging as a strong player now. Internally as well, he's in command of the situation. Opposition parties on the run, opposition leadership abroad mostly. No opposition parties being allowed to work freely in Ethiopia. So he's in command in Ethiopia and outside Ethiopia as well. That is why. And what matters for US is US Ethiopia relations. US wants someone to protect its interests in Africa, in Ethiopia. If PM Abiy can serve this purpose, obviously be appreciated by US government. Secondly, viewers, while PM Abiy is in Washington DC, protests are being planned in the next 3 days. Today, on the 13th of December, in the next 2 days as well, protests will be held outside Convention Center in Washington DC, where African leadership will meet US President Joe Biden and other US top leadership. Separate protests are being planned. The Tigrayan diaspora is sending messages. A social media campaign is underway to mobilize Tigrayans to reach outside Convention Center in Washington DC for demonstrations. Same is happening in the case of Amhara protests. Amhara diaspora community is mobilizing Amhara ethnic group members to make preparations for demonstrations outside Convention Center in Washington DC against PM Abiy, against alleged genocide of Amharas in Amhara region in Oromo other parts of Ethiopia. So we could see separate protests from Tigrayans and Amharas against PM Abiy in front of Convention Center in Washington DC. Oromos could join as well. We have seen some protests from Oromo diaspora community in the US, in London in recent days, and since now in the Oromo region, protests are ongoing against the government. We could see Oromo diaspora start protests as well in the US against PM Abiy. It will be interesting to see who is going to protest against PM Abiy in the US outside Convention Center. We'll try to update you about PM Abiy's engagements and diaspora's activities in Washington DC. Lastly, viewers, Oromia region of Ethiopia. What was happening in Amhara region a few months ago is now being seen in Oromia. I think it was April when Ethiopian federal government and Amhara regional government launched a crackdown on Fano militia. Fano commanders, Fano fighters were arrested, some fled their bases, their strongholds. Zamina Kasi was later arrested a few weeks ago, and Masri Shah could not be arrested, Masafant as well. Fano's recruitment, training activities were stopped. And those journalists, activists who oppose the government in government's action against Fano, against hardliner elements in the Amhara region, those journalists, activists, even politicians were arrested too. And some are still in prison, some have been released. We know that several journalists, founder of Fiti magazine, was arrested, later released. Gobade Sisi arrested, released. Mirza Muhammad, and some others. Now, same is happening in the Oromia region. It is starting to happen, you can say. An Oromo social media activist was arrested yesterday. His name is Goma Sakata. Goma Sakata is very active in social media. He shares mostly updates on the activities of Oromo Liberation Army, whatever is done by OLA. Goma reports, and he was arrested yesterday in Dire Deva. Not the first time that he has been arrested. He was arrested in the past as well, but again he was arrested yesterday, and so far his whereabouts are unknown. Where is he? No one knows. So it means that if protests continue in the Oromia region of Ethiopia, Oromo activists, Oromo voices which are supporting these protests will be silenced. Activists, journalists, politicians could be arrested. Maybe that is why Jawar is not in Ethiopia, Bakle Garba is not in Ethiopia. But question is, who will lead the protests if those who support protests are being arrested? And students being arrested too. We know that some students have been arrested. And it would be difficult for dissenting voices to express themselves in Oromia, outside Oromia, it seems. Government seems to have decided that it now wants to silence those voices which are supporting these demonstrations. And action is being taken not by regional forces, but by federal forces. Goma was arrested by federal police. Federal institutions are being used by the government. Same happened in Amhara region as well. Federal police was involved there. And same is happening in Valaga, where Ethiopian National Defense Force has reportedly told Oromia regional forces to withdraw from some areas. Why? Because ENDF wants to launch an operation against OLA. It does not want to share details of the operation with regional forces because it suspects the presence of pro-OLA elements in regional forces. It means that federal departments, federal forces will take action in and outside Oromia against activists, journalists, and politicians. Goma's whereabouts are still unknown.